Kwanzaa celebrations kick off. Kwanzaa is a Pan-African cultural celebration based on indigenous harvest festivals. Some of you might know Mushwana, for example, that has been celebrated on the continent for thousands of years. According to organisers, Kwanzaa has become a black consciousness fest. Well, joining us in studio now is Baba Buntu from Ebukhosini Solutions to talk about Kwanzaa. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Good morning and thanks for having me.
All right, so this is interesting, this Kwanzaa thing. I mean, I've heard it in American kind of social parlance quite a bit. And, you know, most people, when they hear this, they'll think, hang on, isn't this thing that was started in America in 1966 by, what was his name?
Karenga.
Maulana Ndabezitha Karenga.
Yes.
So what's it doing in South Africa?
Well, I think it starts really on the continent because Karenga and his team of both African and African American researchers were scouting around the continent trying to, with the particular objective to look at what could people in the African diaspora who had kind of been cut off from their language, their national identity, what could they celebrate that would kind of put them in touch and connect them with their roots. And as they did their research, they found that harvest festivals were celebrated very similarly across the continent. And that became kind of the template for what then became Kwanzaa. So when we have then learned about Kwanzaa, we have thought, but it's, hey, hang on, it actually started here. Can we bring it back to the continent? And we decided to stay with the name Kwanzaa, mainly because it had already been popularized. And it's also voiced in a language that has a Pan-African history, Kiswahili, but we really want people to, especially within their family and community space, think about this time of the year also. What does Umkhosi, Dikafela, and a number in Kwala, and a number of these festivals that have been celebrated for a very long time on the continent actually mean?
All right, so let me get this straight. We've got African Americans and Africans in the diaspora wanting to reconnect with their roots. They look to Africa to see what are those things that can help us. And now we're taking it from them and bringing it back here. Is that what you're saying?
Well, let's say we're sharing it. I think many of us have been inspired by what people have done in other countries. We do understand that sometimes we have a lenience to copy things that happen, especially in America. This is not that. This is more as a Pan-African family we see. But this makes sense. I mean, African Americans embraced Kwanzaa largely because they felt they were denied the opportunity to really know their history, their identity. But so we are on the continent, but we also have the same problem. Our history is not fully told. Many struggle with the issues of identity. Blackness is still a very strange and oppressed space. So we thought this is actually a festival that we need to accentuate on the continent as well.
And that was going to be my next question, is that are we then trying to reconnect with our own histories and our own cultures, and not perhaps just in our own areas, but across the continent?
Definitely. And I would say this, over the last few years, I've had an opportunity to be invited to a number of African countries. And I see, in addition to in South Africa, because maybe in South Africa we are getting aware of this now, but young people especially, I would say the youth bracket between 15 and 30, they are asking very critical questions at the moment. They are very ready to reconceptualize, rebuild, and think new. And coming from, let's be honest, our generation and older, to a certain extent, many of us have been very conservative and scared to go into very new and maybe what we perceive as difficult questions. So I feel there's an opportunity right now that Africa as a continent has through its young members who are really asking very critical questions and ready to grapple with things that some of us have thought of as very complex and difficult: religion, spirituality, faith, culture, politics, and new understandings of what it means to be an African person.
All right, so we're going to talk about modernity and what it means in terms of some of these practices just now. But I am curious, when Karenga started this thing, and it was no coincidence, this number 7. Chat to us a little bit about the 7 pillars and adding the A to Kwanzaa to make it become 7. So what's the big deal about the 7, and what are these 7 pillars of Kwanzaa?
Right. So 7 has a history in African spirituality as a symbolism of wholeness. It's accentuated in the mineral world, in the mathematical world, but also within the spiritual world. 7 objects or 7 days and 7 ways of looking at particular incidents have a very strong history within spirituality. So 7 was chosen. There's 7 principles, there's 7 candles, there's 7 days to observe Kwanzaa. And there are principles involved, such as unity, which is the first one, which starts on the 26th of December, tomorrow. It goes to self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, creativity, faith, and purpose. And all these principles, what is very significant about them is, during Kwanzaa, we really invite all members of the Pan-African community. You know, especially in this country, we have a tendency to feel more comfortable with people we can relate to, or people who speak a similar language, or people who observe culture the same way we do. When we meet somebody from, even within the country, from another expression, we are a little bit skeptical, and what is that, and why do they do this? And they are those people, we are these people. And I think during Kwanzaa, we really want to come together as a nation, even if we are different, and maybe especially because we are different, and to learn that being different, there's nothing to be fearful of that. So the principles are easy for anyone, whether you're from a Muslim background, a Christian background, a indigenous African background, to find meaning in. So they really help us to unite and to set goals for the next season.
All right, so give us examples of how do you actually experience Kwanzaa? What kind of things will we see, be able to experience when we celebrate Kwanzaa?
Right. You know, I like to say this, that Kwanzaa gives me, and this is my personal reflection, it gives me a peak view into the Africa that I have devoted every single day of my life to fight for. Meaning an Africa that interacts, where members are interested in each other, where young and old have equal amount of respect, when women and men stand shoulder to shoulder, when somebody from Mali is as significant as somebody from Limpopo, standing together and having an interest in each other, discussing issues of great importance, and actually starting to work together. Because what we've realized over the years is that many people meet at Kwanzaa and they stay in touch, and some have started companies together, some have maybe found a partner during Kwanzaa, and they've found people that they really want to work with and be closer to. And for me, that kind of explains the necessity. Children have a very, very important place in Kwanzaa. During the opening ceremony and several other events as well, we have a children's corner, and we make it playful, but it's really about learning at the same time. Learning history and taking pride in being an African, having aspirations for the future of Africa. And then during the opening ceremony, they come into the bigger event and they explain the 7 principles that I just said now in their own worldview. And that is a very touching experience.
So, Steve Biko, would he have been at Kwanzaa? Is that what this is about?
I believe so. The thing is, because some people would say, why are we celebrating if we see that Africa is still oppressed, we are still struggling with land, governance, economy? What is there really to celebrate? And I think it's not a mindless celebration where we're just putting our food and culture and clothes on and we just mindlessly dance and think nothing of anything else. It is a... Let me call it almost like a warrior celebration. It is taking a stand saying that we're not happy with Africa as it is now, but we need to celebrate the achievements that we have made. In one family, there's a new baby, somebody started a business, somebody has done something that we actually all benefit from. And we need some time to celebrate that so that we can also be inspired to do more, to work harder, and to come closer together.
All right, so it's 2019 around the corner. A lot of people are struggling with modernity. And what is an African in 2019 compared to an African during the days of Shaka and all these other warrior tribes of yesteryear? So what does it mean in a global world to be African? And where does Kwanzaa help us make sense of all of this?
Right. So there's 2 things I want to say about that. I think the importance of Kwanzaa really is expressed throughout the year, not necessarily during the 7 days only. The 7 days is kind of the topping. The real work happens throughout the year. As an organization, Ebukhosini Solutions devotes every single day towards the education of the African child, to empower the African family, to make sure we have strong and reliable unions within our communities. And I think directly to your question of what would a modern African be as opposed to maybe an older African, I think it's still being a warrior, but maybe in a different sense. I think as we have seen with many young people, they have woken up to that Africa actually has a history that we were never taught in school. Africa has a culture that is not demonic and that we must shy away from. We must actually embrace it and use it in our defense and our empowerment. So I think that to me is a modern African, one who's able to look back and see where we come from, but also is very forceful going forward, seeing and envisioning an Africa that is very different from what we see now, that where our power is really being held.
All right, so perhaps a controversial question. Africa has changed quite a bit over time in terms of its people. We had influences come from other parts of the world. And so some Africans are not black. Some Africans are different colors now. Are they able to embrace Kwanzaa in the same way? Because they are people from this continent. They may have just arrived a little bit later than others.
Well, I think the history is a little bit more complex than that. Many people are descendants of people who came with the only objective to destroy, to loot, and to steal, and to kidnap. And that has also, since that story, we're not done with that story. We're still living a very imbalanced and oppressed situation based on what happened in our past. Kwanzaa is distinctly for people of African descent. It's not a reach out and unifying festival with every person on the planet. It speaks particularly to the African path. And then people say, but isn't that exclusionary? Why are you not inviting other people? Because sometimes as a family, you need time with family. Just as I could say to you, but you're celebrating Christmas only with your family. Why don't you invite all the people of the streets? Why don't you invite people from all over the communities? And you say, it's not that I have a problem with them, but sometimes I want to just gather with my family. We want to discuss issues that are important to us. And it doesn't necessarily mean we hate other people. And I think that sums up what Kwanzaa is about as well. It's not so much about who it excludes. It's more about who it is for and who it speaks the story of.
All right. It's the 17th year of Kwanzaa in South Africa. How has it grown over the years? Who's typically coming through, you're finding?
You know, I think that's why we call it a Black Consciousness Fest, meaning that increasingly, I mean, we started with 25 people, a small group of people, mostly young people, but also a few families. Now we have Kwanzaa babies, meaning people who are maybe in their teenagers now, and they were very small at the first Kwanzaa, and they look so much forward to Kwanzaa. So I would say there's a variety of people, and I think this is so beautiful because you find maybe, just to kind of talk about the stereotypes we sometimes have, let's say a little bit of a conservative Christian woman who feel that, but these Rasta people, the way they look, I'm not sure if I can talk to them. But at Kwanzaa, you find them in deep conversation and actually finding that they have a lot in common. You find somebody who's strong and militant and very accentuated in their political understanding, speaking to somebody who has maybe not made up their mind yet about what their political stand. And they find common ground. And I think we need to experience this as African people because we are so used to being separated even from each other. So it is a space of unity.
You know, to be honest, listening to you, I'm fascinated, and I'm just wondering, though, if this isn't one of these kinds of intellectual debates and conversations that people have as they're trying to evolve and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking, come on, you know, we've got 1.1 billion people on the continent now. Kwanzaa must make a difference to the average person, and not having these kind of nice academic conversations that we're having. How does it translate right down there?
Yeah, I feel we have been able to do that. It's not an intellectual conversation. Actually, even those that because we do have a program where there's, I don't even want to call it speeches, there's messages and inspiration. But we have somebody who's 15-year-old who's going to speak, who might not be seen as a speaker in other forums. We have people of all really walks of life. I think the threshold is very, very low and accommodating at Kwanzaa. And I completely agree with you. I have a huge huge concern about that. And throughout all of our activities, we don't allow people to just engage in intellectual conversations that often kind of hits people over the head and don't include people, let me say, on the ground. Kwanzaa and the work that we do through Ebukhosini is really people-oriented. And you don't need a degree. You don't need to speak fancy English. You don't need to present yourself in a certain way. Be who you are, know what you know, and you will be accommodated. You will find a space, and we are interested in your story.
If the Kwanzaa project takes off and it becomes a way of life, how do you think this continent will change? Because I am worried about these borders that were created by colonial masters. And it's such an interesting thing to observe. You know, you literally cross the road and your Hausa brothers and sisters are speaking French and others are speaking English. And yet Hausa is the language that joins the two. How do we bring it all together?
You know, again, I want to repeat a point that I made earlier, that Kwanzaa is 7 days. We have more than 300 days for the rest of the year. And that becomes critical. What are we doing between the Kwanzaa celebrations? And that's what we do as a company. We engage every day in creating spaces of unified actions between African people, young and old, those who have university degrees versus those who have been unemployed and not exposed to schools. We encourage, for instance, homeschool education, that parents also take charge of their child's education, not only complain about what the government system is kind of giving us. So for me, we cannot maybe put too many expectations on a 7-day celebration, but we can put a lot of expectations through the other 300 days. What are we doing I completely agree with you. These borders are only oppressing us. Do you know how difficult it is to travel within this continent? You have to travel outside to come back to another country on the continent. It doesn't make sense. And I think it's time that we encourage, especially our young people, to envision a future where we own that, where we can have that meeting, because I think many of us struggle with, how would we go about eradicating the borders? I think it's very difficult. That would be the mindset of many of us. But young people come in with a different vision and say, you know what, we can actually do that. And working towards that, I think that's such a beautiful thing to be able to contribute to.
Well, sounds very, very exciting. And perhaps the final question, important one, when and where can people just show up and be part of the Kwanzaa opening? Right,
so we are aware that there are Kwanzaa celebrations in Gauteng, which we are part of, in Western Cape, in Eastern Cape, and KZN. In Gauteng, we are starting on the 26th of December. You can find all the invitations and information on Facebook, on Twitter, and if you search also on Google, I think it will come up. But we're starting right here in Johannesburg on 1 Elof Street at a venue called Dorke. We're going to be on a rooftop. There's going to be an extensive African market. There's going to be a children's corner. There's going to be incredible food. And there's going to be nice and inspirational messages. So if you need a little bit of inspiration in your life, you should attend. And then we go from the 27th, we go into different communities. In Gauteng, we go into the Tswana community, to Tembisa, to Katlehong. And then on the last day of Kwanzaa, which is the 1st of January, we go into a farm in Rustenburg. And we've been invited to this farm for quite some years now to do the closing ceremony. And it is such an incredible moment to start the year. I mean, remember what land means in this country. To start on a black-owned farm that has, where the people who own it and operate it have an African consciousness and grow things that we can eat right there. It is a huge
I wish we had another half an hour to talk about this, but I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much.
I hope I might be able to make it to my first Kwanzaa. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Asante. Okay, so that was Baba Buntu talking to us about Kwanzaa. It's happening